Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this exciting webinar, The Art of Cyber War. Got some great things for us today, so hopefully you'll get what you need from this. My name is Mark James. I'm Head of Partner and Customer Management here at ESET UK. The agenda is as follows. We've got Gabriel LaRue, who's our Enterprise Business Development Executive, who's going to give us an introduction to ESET. We've then got the legendary Robert Lipovsky, who's our Principal Threat Intelligence Researcher, who's going to talk to us about how APT groups have turned Ukraine into a cyber battlefield. There'll be an opportunity then for a Q&A at the end, and I would encourage you to use the Q&A. Please pop any questions into the question panel so that you can get any of those important questions over. And just be aware that this probably might be the only opportunity you'll get to ask questions to Robert. So please, pop them in there, and we'll deal with them in the end. If we find out at the end that we run out of time, we will deal with any of those questions that we couldn't do. So just before I jump into the webinar, can I just get somebody to pop a yay for me into the question panel to make sure that you can hear me and you can see the screen. Now, obviously, I appreciate that if you can't hear me, you won't know that I'm asking this question, but hopefully somebody has. Thank you very much, Aid. I appreciate that. Right, so without further ado, again, I'm just going to remind you, please use the Q&A panel. It's really important that you get from this whatever you can. And for that, I am going to pass over to Gabriel. One second, Gabriel, you are now the presenter.
Lovely. Thank you for that, Mark, and good afternoon to everybody in the room. As you said, I'm most excited to hear what Robert's got to say, but I would love to just kind of give you an insight as to who we are and what we're doing at ESET. So I'm just give me one sec. Can you see my screen? Yeah, perfect. So basically, as Mark said, I'm Gabriel LaRue. I head up the enterprise team here at ESET UK. We've got a wide range of attendees today, which means there's a wide range of levels of knowledge about ESET. So I'll try and keep this as relevant to everyone as possible. Basically, we are a digital security company. We used to be antivirus, then we were anti-malware, and now we are a digital security house. By that, it kind of reflects not only the expansion of the attack vectors that we as individuals are exposed to, but also the attack surfaces that it's brought to our global economy as we've all climbed onto the internet and e-commerce as a whole. To give you an understanding of the scale of our business, we deal with over 100 million endpoints globally, and when you include the protection of Google, we also cover over 1 billion internet users. We're the fourth largest company of our type in the world, and protect around 110 million people, indirectly approximately, as I said, with Google, through the app scanning and Chrome cleanup solutions. We've been in the industry over 30 years now, with our history starting in Slovakia. It started all in a garage 30 years ago, and I'm happy to say it's the same owners that we had way back then. What that means to our customers, it's basically taken us to being the #1 security vendor in the EU. And the scale that we've moved on from that garage has come up to over 202 territories worldwide. We've got 13 R&D centers. This is where what really sets us apart from the rest, and 23 offices in countries worldwide. So as I said, we're still privately owned, which means a lot of our money goes into our product and our R&D, and not shareholder returns. This has allowed us to put focus on security first and then market trends thereafter. Less marketing, more longevity, and it's the long game we have in mind. a couple of things that I thought I might touch on that you may not know about us. We've got some really great connections with wider connections with intelligence agencies worldwide, some like the FBI, CIA, Interpol, Europol, a lot more acronyms, others which are regarding organized crime gangs with malicious nation states actors on a daily basis. What that allows us is a very unique sales point of threat intel. The solutions that we've built are based on the intelligence, which keeps them protected from threats that others may not be aware of. The threat reports and threat intel feeds are becoming more important to a wider range of organizations directly to kind of use that information to their own disposal. But I'm going to let Robert tell you a bit of what's inside our own findings inside that space. In short, we are now a threat intelligence-based company. This threat intelligence kind of filters into our knowledge of the attack surface, and we've gone on and built a number of layers around this information that we've learned. This is just a quick insight into what's in our core product, and you can see that we've got a lot of different ways of stopping potential attackers. That's enough about us for now. I'm most excited to hear what Robert has to say. So Mark, I think I'll hand it back to you, and then you can hand over to Robert. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Appreciate that. Okay, Robert, I'm just going to make you the presenter. There you go. It's all yours.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
So I see a split screen at the minute there, Robert. I don't see the presentation just in the center.
So I shared the wrong screen. Just a second. Let's do it like this. How about now?
Excellent. Yeah, that's good.
Correct? Wonderful. Okay, so yeah, I think Gabriel, you did a very good introduction of what ESET is all about. Threat research is at the core of everything that we do. We are a very research-oriented company because we feel that's the only way that we can be positioned to fight the attackers. I mean, it's a never-ending chase and cat and mouse game, and by actually doing the research and tracking each and every of their moves allows us to make the effective protections for our users. Also, you mentioned about our presence and that we're the #1 cybersecurity vendor based in the European Union. What's relevant for my part today is that we are also the most popular cybersecurity vendor in Ukraine as well. So the attacks that I'm covering today are our own original research. I mean, naturally, the whole security industry is looking at the cyber attacks in Ukraine, the cyber war that's been happening there. So a lot of these examples have made it to the mainstream media, but it was actually the majority of them actually originated as our discovery, something that maybe is not that well known. And we have some very unique insight into what's been happening in Ukraine. So aside from that, aside from walking you through the most interesting things that we have been seeing there, I'll try to also tackle the questions whether these Russian cyber attacks can also spill over to other countries, allied countries, NATO countries as well. So I will share what we've seen with that regard and what I feel we'll be facing in the future. Okay, really brief introduction of me. So Robert Lipovsky. I've been researching cyber threats for 15 years now. Over that time, I've looked at various types of threats, both APTs, advanced persistent threats, targeted quite often nation-state sponsored attacks, which is what we'll be focusing on today as well. But also crimeware, and me and both my team that I lead here in the HQ in Bratislava, we provide tracking of botnets, and we cooperate, as Gabriel said, with a lot of law enforcement agencies, and we provide very useful data and telemetry, for example, on command and control infrastructure that can then be used for botnet takedowns, which is very useful for law enforcement as well. And we are also participating in pure vulnerability research as well. So this is we're trying to find bugs in either software, firmware, or even hardware devices as part of our experimental research. An example of this type of research was, for example, our discovery of the Crook vulnerability, which affected the Wi-Fi capable devices, meaning like over 1 billion devices. And then we worked doing coordinated responsible disclosure with the affected vendors before we made our results public and so on. Okay, so let's get to the topic at hand. So I think this sad day needs no introduction. Everybody knows the events of February 24th this year. And on the cyber front, in fact, just a couple of hours before that day, on February 23rd, 2022, we detected destructive wiper malware in a number of high-profile organizations in Ukraine. But before I go into details on that attack, let's take a step back in time, because Ukraine has been heavily targeted by cyber attacks for years now. And we've actually begun observing a notable increase in targeted AP attacks in the country since 2014. And that also correlates with the geopolitical events happening on the ground. So this was the time of the Russian occupation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Donbass. Over the years, we have traced the attacks to a number of APT groups, and here are some of the most notable ones. And of course, we won't have time to go into detail on each and every one of them, but I will focus on the most aggressive of these groups, which is Sandworm. And this has been attributed by intelligence agencies of various countries that you see down there on the screen. It has been attributed to the Russian Military Intelligence Service, the GRU. And in October 2020, the FBI even released a public indictment of 6 GRU hackers for taking part in some of the attacks that we'll be discussing next. By the way, in case you're wondering why Sandworm, where the group got its name, so in some of the early campaigns that were using malware that we're calling Black Energy, we discovered these text strings that you can see here on the screen in the command and control addresses used by the malware at that time. These campaigns were relatively short-lived in 2014, but the moniker Sandworm stuck since then. So apparently the operators were fans of Frank Herbert's classic novel. Also, here's a decoy document that was being used at the time. So we have been tracking their activities from even before that. We've been tracking some Black Energy attacks since 2012. This is one of the earliest campaigns that we found in our telemetry. And so we've been tracking them for many years now. And over those years, we detected more and more campaigns against high-value targets in Ukraine since around the end of 2013. As I said, we've seen attacks before, like in 2012, but they really intensified from the end of 2013 and early 2014. Sandworm targeted all types of organizations, including government, diplomatic, media, transportation, even the Ukrainian elections. In terms of their main dissemination mechanisms, one of the main methods that Sandworm used to infiltrate organizations was through these carefully crafted, very highly targeted spear phishing emails. And here's one example that even used the war in Donbass as a lure. The translation, I won't go word for word, but the rough translation from Ukrainian says that Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who was the prime minister at the time, was instructing various members of parliament, various ministry, internal affairs, Ministry of Justice, NGOs, and so on, for their involvement in the support of separatists in the East. And in the attachment to that email, there was a PowerPoint presentation with a list of these alleged separatist supporters. So as you can see, this is some very good social engineering here. This isn't your common Nigerian prince camp, and had a pretty good chance of being opened by the recipients. In the background, as you can probably guess, this would eventually lead to the download and installation of the Black Energy malware from an attacker's remote server. On a technical note, this was also exploiting a zero-day vulnerability in PowerPoint. So the recipients could have had the latest and greatest fully patched versions of Windows and Office installed and still become compromised. So Black Energy was used in many campaigns against many organizations in Ukraine, but beyond a doubt, the most notable attack was the one against the Ukrainian power grid. And this one, this attack was planned several months in advance, and it culminated in December 2015 when it became the first ever blackout ever caused by a cyber attack. So this was a historically very significant event. This attack was facilitated by the Black Energy malware, and I choose that word facilitated carefully, and you'll see why when I talk about in the story how that differed from this Black Energy 2015 attack. So it was facilitated by Black Energy, and it was carried out in a coordinated manner against at least 4 electric distribution companies in various regions of Ukraine. These companies are called Oblenergos, from Oblast meaning regional energy company. And then the attackers then misused remote access connections to manually switch off the flow of electricity. And as a result, the homes of around 230,000 Ukrainians across the nation went dark for 4, maybe even up to 6 hours, depending on which region we're talking about. So here's a video taken by one of the operators at one of those targeted electric substations. And this video is interesting because it's showing the attacker remotely. Sorry, I'll mute the sound. It's showing the attackers remotely connecting to that workstation, and it's interacting with the SCADA software there, manipulating the switches, the circuit breakers. And now you can see, look, it's not me who's touching the mouse or the keyboard. So that was the first mass power outage caused by a cyber attack, but the attackers didn't stop there. Almost exactly 1 year later, in December 2016, there was another blackout caused by a cyber attack again, and this time the attackers really stepped up their game. This time there were quite a number of differences, and there was only one electricity substation being hit, but it was a large one. It was the Kiev North transmission substation. Also, the attackers, they had much higher ambitions. We discovered the malware that they used in this attack in Destroyer, And unlike the previous year's manual disruption facilitated by Black Energy, Indestroyer was the first ever malware specifically designed to attack power grids in an automated way. What that means is that it was able to communicate with those switches and circuit breakers, what you just saw in that video just a second ago. So Indestroyer was able to send commands to these devices in their own industrial language. This slide shows the Indestroyer architecture, and I won't go into all of those technical details. What I want you to take away from this is that Indestroyer was a modular framework. So there were a lot of different components, and down there at the bottom, you see the 4 payload components. So each of those contain a separate implementation of a different industrial communication protocol. So, as I said, Indestroyer, quote unquote, spoke these 4 different protocols and in an automated way at a specified time. So this was a specific time hard-coded in the code. It would send these commands to circuit breakers to de-energize the power line. So that was one of its main objectives. But as I indicated, the attackers wanted to accomplish more than that. So the second step was to wipe SCADA software so that operators couldn't see the status of the environment, that they couldn't control it. Thirdly, Indestroyer would attempt to disable protection relays, and these protection relays, as the name suggests, they play a very important role. They protect the power grid from harmful states by monitoring current, voltage, frequency, and by disabling these, the grid could become vulnerable. Then, based on experience from the previous year, the operators would go into manual mode to restore the flow of electricity, and the attackers were actually counting on this. And if the protective relays had been disabled, then the grid could become unstable and possibly even lead to physical damage of hardware, which we believe was their ultimate goal. Had this been successful, so it wasn't, but had it been successful, the outage could last not hours, but days or perhaps even weeks until that damaged hardware was repaired or replaced. So the Russians had high ambitions in this Indestroyer attack, but they failed, part because of better resilience of the Ukrainian defenders, and in part because of coding mistakes that they made in the Indestroyer code. So in the years after that, there was a lot of evolution of the tool set used by Sandworm, and we were monitoring them on a very granular level, and we saw that the group kind of split its activities. On the one hand, there was the gray energy cluster, which continued attacks against the energy sector. And then there was the Telebots cluster, which carried out attacks against mainly the financial sector in Ukraine. And Telebots was also the subgroup behind the infamous NotPetya outbreak in June 2017. And this disruptive fall ransomware, and by fall ransomware, I mean that it was ransomware, yes, it did encrypt files, and it also displayed this ransom message, but it wasn't doing it for financial gain. That was just a cover. Its actual goal was disruption, sowing chaos, a demonstration of power of the Russian hackers. And the disruption was enormous. It crippled the whole country. As you can see on this slide, people couldn't pay at point of sales terminals in supermarkets. They couldn't buy gas at gas stations. And everyone saw the effects of this malware. The whole cybersecurity industry was analyzing it, but it was actually ESET researchers who uncovered 2 important things about NotPetya. The first, the attribution. So we discovered that GRU's Sandworm was behind this attack. And secondly, we drill down to the origin, how this enormous outbreak started, or the patient zero. The question everyone was asking at the time was, how come it was able to spread so quickly all over the country? And we found the answer to that. The compromise spread from a small software company called MEDoc, which, even though it was small, it was an influential company. It was the provider of the most popular accounting software used by the majority of companies in Ukraine. And through the supply chain compromise of MEDoc, the GRU was able to infect companies all over the country and eventually launch the NotPetya outbreak. And after a few hours, its destructive potential also spread globally beyond Ukraine's borders. So this was because NotPetya also propagated as a network worm using the NSA-leaked Eternal Blue exploit. And many global companies had branches and network connections to Ukraine and got infected this way. The damage was enormous, and even today, NotPetya is considered to be the most devastating, the most costly cyber attack in history, with damages adding up to over $10 billion. And that number is probably just the tip of the iceberg, reported by some of the largest victims, like the transportation giants of Maersk and FedEx, the US-based pharma company Merck, and even the Russian oil corporation Rosneft, which is curious. And so, although the spillover beyond Ukrainian borders, and probably the Rosneft compromise, was unintended collateral damage, there were other cases, there were other attacks where it was not. So we have witnessed over the years some cases when the GRU sandworm deliberately targeted organizations in Poland, in Georgia, in France as well, and also together with some of the other Russian APT groups, also other NATO countries. So I would say that this pretty much answers the question that everyone is often asking: should we be worried? Can other countries outside of Ukraine can also be targeted? Well, they already have been. Yes, the risk is real, and we need to be prepared and expect future attacks. So those most notable, those most visible attacks by sandworm happened between 2015 and 2017. And in the following years, the GRU continued to be active, but kept a much lower profile until now. So the attack using the malware we are calling Hermetic Wiper started on February 23rd this year, shortly before 5 p.m. Ukrainian local time, preceding the Russian military invasion by only a couple of hours. We found this Hermetic Wiper on hundreds of systems in at least 5 Ukrainian organizations, and it was trying to corrupt their data and make the computers unbootable, and in effect, any public-facing services inaccessible. On a technical level, it would wipe the master boot record, the master file table, and other critical files like registry hives. And also, it was disabling volume shadow copies to hinder recovery efforts. So Hermetic Wiper, we consider it to be one of the more advanced wipers that we've seen. An example of that is that for its file system operations, it's using a hijack of a driver of legitimate disk partitioning software. And the timestamp of the executable suggests that it was compiled on December 28, 2021, indicating that the malware was prepared for several months in advance before it was eventually deployed. When we look at the campaign, Hermetic Wiper wasn't the only malicious code that was deployed in that attack. There was also a worm, which we're calling Hermetic Wizard, that was used to spread the threat on the local network. And then there was Hermetic Ransom, which was also a fall ransomware, like NotPetya was. By the way, one of the components in Hermetic Wizard it was named Romance DLL, probably a reference to the Eternal Romance exploit, even though no exploits were actually used in this campaign. And if you think about it, it's kind of strange to employ a wiper and a decoy ransomware, which are essentially the same thing, right, in one campaign. And even more so, Hermetic Ransom was poorly written in contrast to the relatively advanced Hermetic Wiper. A possible explanation to that is that the malware was being deployed through a group policy, so the machines would be downloading it at different times as they were being turned on, and attackers probably tried to deploy Hermetic Ransom after we were already detecting and blocking Hermetic Wiper. Here's the ransom message that was displayed by Hermetic Ransom after encrypting the victim's files. And these are some Easter eggs that we found in the code. Then on March 14th, we discovered another dangerous wiper in Ukraine. We called it Caddy Wiper. And according to our telemetry, Caddy Wiper was found on dozens of systems in a few organizations in the financial sector. It was a notable feature that it had was that it was avoiding destroying data on domain controllers in order to retain access inside those organizations while still disrupting operations. Then on April 8th, we were contacted by CERT UA to help them respond to a cyber incident which affected an energy provider in Ukraine and to help them analyze a suspicious piece of malware. And when we analyzed it, we found out that the threat was bigger than originally expected because it was a new version of Indestroyer. So just to reiterate this was only the third time in history when hackers tried to tamper with the distribution of electricity. All three of those cases happened in Ukraine. All three of them were attempted by Sandworm, the Russian GRU, and this latest time at a time of full-scale war. And while the first Indestroyer incident resulted in a blackout lasting for about 1 hour, this latest one didn't even accomplish that. The attack was thwarted thanks to our work, the outstanding work by the defenders at the targeted Energo company, the CERT UA, and also the support of our Ukrainian partner and the assistance of ESET researchers. But although no blackout actually took place, it was still a big deal. Because had this attack been successful, then more than 2 million people could have been left in the dark, since the targeted Oblenergo is the provider of electricity in a region with that many people. So in my opinion, this was the most significant cyber attack during the war thus far. If we look at Indestroyer 2 on a technical level, it appears as a simplified version of the original in some ways. For example, it was being deployed as a single Windows executable, and it spoke only one protocol compared to the 4 that were implemented in the original Indestroyer. And it shares a lot of code similarity with the first version 2, and we assess that it was built from the same source code. Also, the Indestroyer 2 incident employed additional malware to amplify the impact of that disruption, and specifically through wipers with the intention to make recovery more difficult and to cover the attacker's tracks to thwart post-incident investigation. These wipers were implemented for multiple platforms. For Windows, there was a new version of Caddy Wiper, which we first saw on March in March, the previous month, and then there were other implementations for Linux and for Solaris. We analyzed 2 Indestroyer 2 samples. Both of them appear to be compiled on March 23rd. But this is just the compilation timestamp. Obviously, this was preceded by lengthy coding of the malware and a lot of reconnaissance work. According to our information, the attackers have been in some of those systems that were targeted since at least mid-February. So even before the invasion began. So to finish up the part about these attacks, what I just covered really is just the tip of the iceberg. We have seen quite more of the attacks, and many other attacks by both Sandworm and also some of the other Russian APT groups, some of which have also been attributed to 3-letter agencies, so both the GRU, but also the SVR and the FSB. But I will stop and mention one other APT group, that's Gamma Radon, which has been attributed to the FSB, and which is by far the most active APT in Ukraine. And what they lack in sophistication, at least compared to Sandworm, they make up for in volume. Because we've been detecting attacks by Gamma Radon almost on a daily basis in the past couple of years. They are very, very active. So to summarize the role of these Russian cyber operations in this conflict, I would split them into 2 main objectives. The first one being espionage, and of course, depending on the target, if it's a diplomatic target, military, this can provide the adversary strategic or tactical advantage in the conflict. And then the other type is sabotage. So these are all the campaigns that were being deployed for disruption, destruction, and also just for signaling a demonstration of power. So what do we do about all of this? So Gabriel already showed our multi-layered ecosystem, and this is just to illustrate, this is just to show that there is no silver bullet answer to all of this. There is no one magic technology. We have to rely on a multiple layers of them. In case the attackers get passed by one detection layer, we still have other layers in place to be able to spot, to detect, and to block the attack. And we're implementing this multi-layered approach both on the endpoint, so that's what you can see here. These are the various layers of protection running in our endpoint security software, but also in the whole security ecosystem. So that talks to ESET Library, is tied to our XDR solutions, ESET Inspect, and other layers in the ecosystem that should be deployed by organizations. Also, another layer to this is threat intelligence. So, as I said, this is the direct result of our research, of our work. Having this knowledge about those threats, and of course we're building this knowledge, we're feeding it back into our endpoint protection software, making sure that it's detecting and blocking those threats. But we're also putting that threat intelligence into the form of, for example, our private APT reports. The 2 examples that you can see on the screen, the 2 different formats that we're putting out. One is the technical analysis, which go very much in depth in several like concrete campaigns of threats, and activity summaries are released bi-weekly, so twice a month, detailing the activity that we've seen for the APT groups that we have been tracking and the developments that we've witnessed in the past 2 weeks. For both of these reports, what they have in common is that they provide very actionable data. So a lot of IOCs, Yara rules, MITRE attack tables, and basically allow the recipients to be able to use them for hunting those threats in their environment. Of course, this part of that information is something that we also release publicly. For example, on our blog, We Live Security, that I do encourage you to check out if you haven't yet. And also on our Twitter account, at ESET Research. And with that, I will open up for Q&A. Thank you for listening. Here are some of my contact details if you wish to contact me afterwards and ask some follow-up questions sometime in the future. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was excellent. Very interesting and very intriguing. I'm just going to see if there's any questions pop in there, but I've got a couple aimed at you, not specifically aimed from me as somebody that works from ESET, but just the sort of things that people say to me, you know, around this sort of thing. Everything you talk about there, you know, a lot of it is sort of centered over, you know, in the Ukraine. How does that affect us? You know, what relationship does that have with, you know, the chap or lady that arrives at their bank in London and works for the day? You know, how does that affect them? What's the correlation there?
Yeah, so it all boils down to what type of potential target you are, whether we're talking about individuals who are quite often employees in companies, or whether we're talking about businesses, large organizations or enterprises, then of course the risk differs quite greatly. As I outlined in the presentation already, so the attacks, while they were focusing on Ukraine, they were not attacking Ukraine exclusively. So we've seen these GRU attackers targeting other European and NATO organizations outside Ukraine as well. I mentioned Gray Energy briefly, so we've seen them attacking energy companies, so critical infrastructure in Poland, for example. We've seen the Xeramel, so also Telebot's malware in France. So the Russians, that while Ukraine is their primary target, they have secondary targets in other countries as well. So of course this is an actual threat for large organizations, the public sector. When we talk about the private sector, then the main risks for those are any unintended collateral damage, like we've seen in the NotPetya case, that affected, I mean, some of the world's largest corporations. Of course, that was quite an exceptional thing that doesn't happen often. But what happens often, and this is not something that we're seeing with these three-letter agency sponsored APT groups, but that's crimeware. So even though these nation state sponsored attacks are the main topic that we discussed today, that doesn't mean that cyber criminal organizations are not operational. They very much are. Well, at least some or many of them, like we all probably heard about the developments with the Conti group, which was one of the major ransomware groups, which had part of their members being Russian and part being Ukrainian. And as the war broke out, they leaked some of their internal communication, which gave us a very interesting inside look into how they operate. But of course, apart from Conti, there are many other cyber criminal organizations, either Russian speaking or also from other countries, that are something that businesses of all sizes need to watch out for, because I mean these threats are either steady numbers or are slowly rising.
Excellent, thank you. And I would imagine that we have a degree of potential concern on the repurpose of this malware being used in an opportunistic method, later down the line where the source codes are leaked, other people, other groups get hold of them and use, what they've seen as successful code to literally just put together something and just push it out there in the hope that they're going to get something exciting, which we often see, in our industry.
Yeah, and I would also say that while maybe some, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, you could say that when looking at the threat landscape, on the one side of the spectrum, you would have the advanced APTs, and on the other, you would have the, let's say, less sophisticated e-crime malware. Nowadays, it's not so clear cut, and the boundaries are quite blurry, and you have very advanced crimeware that's quite often using the tactics and techniques that were previously quite often typically only common for APTs. So what that essentially means is that as a business, even if you might not be the primary target for a nation state sponsored APT, their attack techniques are something that might target you, and the attack can be coming from just a cyber criminal as well. So you need to beef up your defenses and basically approach your cybersecurity as if you were a high profile target.
Sure, and of course we always need to consider that we may not necessarily be the target. We just may be a conduit. It may be that the attack is designed for somebody we know or somebody we're familiar with, or even family members. I think we often fall into the trap thinking to ourselves, hey, what does anybody want with me? I'm not important. But you may play golf with the CEO of a large corporation. You may have a family member who works somewhere that is a target. So that's always something we should be thinking about. I've got a question from Paul. It says, besides energy infrastructure, have you seen evidence of attacks on mobile or fixed telecoms infrastructure, telephony, or internet data services?
I like to say that in Ukraine, probably yes. Over those years, this was probably some of the targets. I can't recall attacks on these types of organizations outside, or at least being conducted by these groups. But that doesn't mean it's something that's not going to happen in the future. So we need to anticipate that as well.
Yeah. And I have a question from Stuart that says a similar sort of thing. I assume the UK electricity infrastructure is different to Ukraine. It is. So would they have to recode to attack the UK? Russia built a lot of Ukraine's networks, therefore they will have an in-depth knowledge to draw on.
Yeah, so it is different. And but something that I really want to highlight, so Indestroyer was, I would say the attack itself was very sophisticated. The malware itself wasn't, all that. I mean, coding the malware is only part of the picture. The whole sophistication of the attack lies in understanding of the environment. So I mentioned that it spoke the first version, those 4 communication protocols, the second version, one of them. The attackers, they knew specifically what we call them IOAs, information object addresses. For those sysadmins in the audience, you can think of these as network ports in an ICS environment of sorts. They are custom configured to that environment, and the attackers, they knew what they were doing, they knew what they were targeting. So I would say the real sophistication of the attack lies not in coding the malware. I mean, that was, not that exceptional. what was exceptional was their very deep understanding of that environment. So if they wanted to target the British or any other power grid, then the danger really lies in the motivation and the resources, the dedication that they have demonstrated into getting acquainted with those environments. So yeah, it would, of course, the malware as it was created could not just be deployed as is, but modifying the malware is I would say just the easy part. The reconnaissance and understanding how that environment is laid out, that is the actual threat.
Sure. So does this sort of underline the importance of things like threat intelligence and sort of network data awareness, so that you have an understanding of everything that's going on within your networks, both in and out, which is immediately suspicious, or grouped together could form some kind of suspicious activity? Is that the sort of thing where this is helpful? Is that a plus?
Yeah, definitely. So you have to realize that, yeah, we try to highlight the importance of endpoint protection platforms that's able to detect and block malware, but malware is only part of the arsenal of the attackers. Quite often, for example, as we demonstrated with the in that video in the December 2015 Black Energy attack, they were using tools that were already being used for legitimate purposes as well. So living off the land techniques and using scripts which are not malicious in and of themselves. And this is something that, yeah, the threat intelligence can help you pinpoint, and also EDR or XDR solutions giving you better visibility into your environment.
Sure. And of course, that's the thing, I think a lot of organizations now, use, AV on the desktop and AV in their server environment, because, for a lot of people, they feel they just have to. It's a thing now. We all understand we've got to have it. It doesn't really excite people, but we've just got to do it. But the importance here is they are key identifiers in passing information back to these information systems that enable us to look at things that perhaps we wouldn't spot straight off the bat, with the typical malware that we've seen before. And like you say, I think we're seeing more and more now of general activity which singularly isn't malicious, but when it's grouped together or with certain intentions, or indeed with certain authentications, can turn into something that's that's very malicious. So that's the end of the questions come through there. And my last sort of question, stroke, sort of identifier would be what sort of measures should organizations be looking at to mitigate, the possible cyber fallout from the deployment of these types of attacks?
I would say that the typical cybersecurity advice that we've been giving out for years is still very relevant. Also an indicator that just because we have seen this escalation of cyber war this year, it's not something that organizations just suddenly need to start thinking about. It's supposed to, the cyber defense really needs to be systematic and long term. So that I would like to be the main takeaway from this. Of course, the specific advice, the regular stuff, definitely makes the jobs of the attackers much more difficult. So hardening access, using multi-factor authentication, having backups in place, and of course, educating your employees not to fall for those phishing or spear phishing campaigns, being better resilient. So all of that can definitely help.
Sure. And one just last thing for me is, we often fall into this environment where, we do phishing campaigns and we talk to the people we work with, whether that's staff or colleagues, about the importance of not clicking on emails and those sort of things. But of course, the problem is when these types of attacks come with a level of trust, where they fall in a situation where they tie in with something real life, you know, where you've perhaps had a spell in hospital or some kind of medical, and all of a sudden an email pops in with a random, random message that states, you know, regarding something that's familiar with you. And I think one of the key sort of takeaways from this is making sure that people feel comfortable bringing up, you know, things that they may seem isn't quite right or doesn't quite fit. You know, sometimes they can be an early indicator that something wrong. You know, and it's ultra important that everybody has a good line, you know, of inquiry that they can just push an inquiry to. And if it indeed turns out to be nothing, that it's just treated, you know, as that. You know, there's no, you know, people don't feel that it was a waste of time, or people don't feel that they shouldn't have done it in the first place.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we are coming to the end now. Sort of 5 minutes. If anybody has any questions at all, please drop them into the question panel as I wrap up this last few minutes by saying thank you very much, Robert. As always, your expertise in this field is fantastic, and I know we appreciate you at ESET. And you know, these sort of things bring lots of information to people that wouldn't necessarily get that information. And like you say, there's a couple of good places to pick up on that. Wheel of Security, you know, is a very good opportunity to do that. Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for your insight into ESET.
Thank you all.
For anybody that's asking, there will be an email that'll go out later at the end that will have a link to the recording of this webinar. And please look out for any future webinars coming your way from us at ESET. So with that being said, thank you all very much indeed for your time. Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Gabriel.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.